This slideshow is going to focus on the outcomes of the French and Indian War. Specifically, it's going to focus on the growing tension between North American colonists and the British. As we know, the British and the colonists fought together to win the war, but their different ideas about what this victory meant led to conflict in the aftermath of the war. So as we know, the British and colonial forces were victorious against the French, and the outcome of this victory was that the French were expelled from North America. And the territory that the French held, aka New France, was split between the British, who got all of the land east of the Mississippi, and the Spanish, who got all of the land to the west of the Mississippi. And in return for all of this land, the Spanish gave the territory of Florida to the English. So if you look at the map there, you'll see that the English, who are the green, controlled all of North America to the west of the Mississippi and a giant chunk of Canada as well. But Britain's victory brought with it some complications. One of the most immediate complications is known as Pontiac's Rebellion. So how Pontiac's Rebellion worked is that this guy, Pontiac, who is an Indian chief in the Ohio Territory, sensed that the French defeat meant that the British would go on to exterminate the Native American populations in the Ohio Territory, because that's what the British had done elsewhere. Because he believed this, Pontiac led a military force against the British, and at first has great success. He destroys a number of forts in the Ohio Territory, and it's only after a while that the British succeed in defeating him, and then they defeat him partially through a very underhanded tactic where they distribute blankets infected with smallpox to members of Pontiac's tribe. And they weaken him this way and then can defeat him militarily. So they use a form of biological warfare to defeat Pontiac. But even though Pontiac lost, he did succeed in scaring the British. And in response to Pontiac's rebellion, the British make the Proclamation of 1763. And in this proclamation, they declare to all the Native Americans that the British would not settle anywhere west of the Appalachian Mountains. So if you look at the map, that red line, the British declared that they would not settle anywhere beyond that red line. That basically the Indians would be free to do whatever they wanted on the other side of that line. And the idea here was to calm the Indians down and prevent them from attacking the British in the same way that Pontiac did. This is important because it makes sense for the British, but it makes the the colonists angry, because the American colonists believe that they earned this territory by fighting against the French. And so we're seeing a split here between the British strategy and what the colonists desire. The war also leads to friction because it leads to a shift in colonial attitudes. It changes the way the colonists think about themselves. First of all, the war required the colonists to cooperate with one another. People from all different colonies worked together to help to defeat the French. And this led the colonists to begin to see themselves as a single group rather than a bunch of different independent communities. And there's this famous cartoon, which you can see here, published by Benjamin Franklin, which encouraged all of the colonies to work together and join into a single force rather than to remain separate. As you can see here, a snake chopped up into little tiny pieces is not very strong, but if the snake could join together, it could become a powerful force and defeat the French and the Indians. Another thing that changes is that after the war is over, there are fewer outside threats to the colonies. Before the war, the colonists had to worry about Indian attacks, they had to worry about Spanish attacks from Florida, and they had to worry about French attacks. And for this reason, they were very dependent upon Britain, who promised to protect them. After the war, though, they don't really feel like they need Britain as much because all of these dangers have been pushed away. On top of this, the colonists now believe in themselves in terms of their military abilities. They fought on the front lines along with the British, and they noticed that they were performing quite well. They did at least as well as the British did when it came to fighting in the Ohio Territory. They also saw the British fail multiple times, which made them realize that the British were not invincible and that maybe they could be stood up to if they needed to be. Basically, the Americans start to wonder whether they actually need the British. They live a whole ocean away. What's the point of being ruled over by the British when they can unite and defend themselves? That is, the colonists can. Another important effect of the war was financial. That is, Britain just fought a 9-year-long world war, and this is extremely expensive, and the British find themselves with a huge debt, and they have to figure out how to pay this debt off. They decide that the colonists should help to pay for the debt from the war because the British fought much of the war in the colonies to protect them. Basically, we defended you, colonies, now you have to help us pay for the war. Seems fair, right? So basically, the British impose a bunch of taxes, and they also rely on mercantilist trade restrictions to force the colonies to pay them back for the war. This has the effect of squeezing the colonies. It makes it harder for the average colonial person to make ends meet because the British are siphoning money out of the colonies. And some of the colonists react angrily to these new British regulations. This is one of the first and most important steps toward the American Revolution, which we'll spend a lot more time talking about next week. But so just to summarize, the French and Indian War led to friction between the British and the colonial Americans for a couple of reasons. First, the colonists felt that they didn't need the British as much as they used to because there are fewer threats and they have greater self-confidence. Second, the British feel like the colonists owe them big time for the war that they just fought. The British spent a ton of money defending the colonies, and now they feel that the colonists should pay higher taxes and put up with more British regulation. So the colonists want less to do with Britain than ever, and Britain wants more to do with the colonists than ever before. And it's this split in the attitudes that leads to conflict after the French and Indian War, and eventually leads to the American Revolution. That's why the French and Indian War is so important in American history. Only a few key terms today. The main points of this slideshow are more big picture conceptual stuff, causation. So what I want you to have gotten out of this slideshow is what changes happened in British and colonial mindsets that led to friction between the two groups and started off the process of revolution and independence.